I stared at the email, reading it for the 5th time, as if the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something less terrifying. But they didn't. They stayed cold and formal and sharp-edged like a court summons. Mr. Arthur Sterling requests the presence of his son, Mr. David Sterling, and his companion, Ms. Ava Peters, for a formal dinner at his private residence. There was no please, no time suggestion, no warmth. Just a date, a time, and a location, like being called to judgment. David sat next to me on our tiny apartment's worn-out sofa, his fingers tapping against the edge of his phone. He wasn't looking at me. He hadn't looked me in the eye since the email arrived. His jaw was clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. "This is it," he muttered. I tilted my head. "You okay?" "No," he admitted, finally glancing at me, his eyes tired and distant. "You don't understand. My father, he doesn't do this. He hasn't invited anyone to his estate in years. This isn't a dinner. It's a test." I wanted to tell him he was being dramatic, but something about the way he said test made my stomach drop. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "So we prepare. What does he like? What does he hate?" David stood up and began pacing. Everything is a performance with him. Appearance, timing, conversation, it's all judged. We're chess pieces in his game. Then came the rules. He made me a handwritten list, pages long, of topics to avoid, things to say, things not to say, what to wear, even how to fold my napkin. I thought he was kidding. He wasn't. "Don't talk about your job at the nonprofit," he thinks charity is for fools. "Don't mention your parents being a teacher and a nurse. Too humble. Stick to safe topics, art, classical music, global finance. Wear the navy blue dress I bought you. And the cashmere scarf. And for the love of God, Ava, do not be late." Every night that week, David grew more anxious. He barely ate. He practiced his own answers aloud. I heard him rehearsing in the shower, his voice strained with the weight of decades of unmet expectations. I tried to stay calm, to be supportive. But deep down, a quiet resentment was blooming. Was I really that unpresentable? Was the man he wanted me to be at that table even the person I was? On the day of the dinner, I woke up at 5 a.m., even though I barely slept. I steamed the dress, polished my shoes, and combed through online etiquette forums like I was cramming for a final exam I didn't remember signing up for. I didn't eat breakfast. My stomach was in knots. As I wrapped the scarf around my neck, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. I looked the part, composed, elegant, completely unrecognizable. I wanted to laugh. Or cry. David had already left earlier that morning to prepare the house. He'd booked me a train ticket, with instructions to take a taxi from the station straight to the estate. "No delays," he'd texted. "Please, Ava." But when the train pulled into the station, an ivy-covered old money town an hour from the city, I didn't head for the taxi stand right away. I paused. There was a weight in my chest I couldn't shake. A sense of being swallowed whole by someone else's world. I didn't belong in mansions and crystal chandeliers. I belonged in community centers, planting gardens with kids who'd never seen the inside of a dining room with more than one fork. I needed air. I needed to walk. It was only a mile. The sidewalks were pristine, the air smelled like pine and money. Every gate I passed was taller than my apartment's ceiling. This wasn't just wealth, it was fortress wealth. The kind that builds walls as thick as its pride. I walked slowly, heels clicking on cobblestones. The dress swayed gently around my legs, and the cashmere scarf kept my neck warm despite the cool autumn wind. I checked my watch. I had just under 25 minutes. Enough time. Barely. That's when I saw him. An old man, hunched on a bench near a manicured green. His coat was threadbare, his hands bare and red from the cold. He didn't belong in this neighborhood, just like me. Our eyes met for a second. And something inside me paused. A flicker. A pang. The echo of my grandmother's voice, soft and certain from long ago. The true test of your character, sweetheart, is how you treat someone who can do absolutely nothing for you. I looked down at the scarf. I looked at the sandwich in my bag. And I looked at the time. 17 minutes left. The clock was ticking. But my heart was louder. I hesitated at the edge of the path, torn between duty and instinct. The man sitting on the bench looked completely out of place, like a forgotten character in a polished painting. His coat was too thin for the wind, and his hands trembled as he held them close to his chest. The lines on his face weren't just from age, they were carved by hardship, loss, and years of being ignored. No one else looked at him. Joggers passed, dogs tugged on leashes, but he was invisible. Except to me. I took a step forward. Then another. "Excuse me," I said softly. "Are you all right?" He looked up, startled, his eyes an icy blue that still shimmered with clarity despite everything else about him seeming worn and weary. For a heartbeat, he studied me, not with suspicion, but with a kind of gentle curiosity. "Just a bit cold, young lady," he rasped. "And seems I missed the lunch service at the shelter today." I glanced at my bag, where the turkey and Swiss sandwich sat wrapped in wax paper. It wasn't much, just something I'd thrown together between ironing and panic. But it was all I had. Without a word, I pulled it out and offered it to him. "It's not fancy," I said, "but it's fresh. And it's yours." He stared at the sandwich like it was made of gold, his expression unreadable, half disbelief, half something deeper. "That's very kind," he said finally, taking it carefully, like it might disappear if he moved too quickly. "Thank you." A gust of wind blew, and I saw him shiver. Reflexively, I reached up and untied the scarf from around my neck, the one David had carefully selected, the one he said would make me look respectable. "You need this more than I do," I said, gently draping it across his shoulders. He looked down at it, his fingers brushing the soft fibers, then back up at me. "You are a kind woman," he said, his voice quieter now. Almost reverent. I smiled, though my chest felt tight. I checked my watch and felt my stomach drop. I had less than 10 minutes. "I have to go," I said, already stepping away. "Take care of yourself, okay?" "Always," he nodded, and added, "And you, Ms. Ava," I called back over my shoulder. He nodded again, almost like he was sealing the name inside his memory. "Good luck, Ava." I didn't have time to ask how he knew I'd need it. I half-jogged down the rest of the lane, my heels catching in the soft grass at the edge of the sidewalk, my heart pounding harder with each step. The estate wasn't far now, just one more turn. But my mind wasn't on the directions anymore. It was on that man's eyes, the way he looked at me. Not with pity or need, but with recognition. Like he saw through the nerves and the dress and the list of rules, and saw me. As I approached the massive wrought iron gates of the Sterling estate, I slowed down to catch my breath. The golden S at the center of the gates gleamed in the afternoon sun like a warning. I reached for the intercom and pressed the button with trembling fingers. "Ava Peters," I said, trying to sound confident. There was a pause. A long one. Then a buzz. The gates creaked open slowly, as if judging me on the way in. The driveway was a ribbon of flawless asphalt framed by towering oaks. Everything about this place was designed to intimidate, to make you feel small. And it worked. I'd faced boardrooms full of cynical donors, marched in protests, comforted families at their lowest. But nothing made me feel as exposed as this walk to the front door. David was waiting at the top of the stone steps, pacing like a tiger behind glass. When he saw me, he rushed down, his face twisted in panic and fury. "Ava, where the hell have you been?" he hissed, grabbing my elbow. "You're 17 minutes late." He hates lateness. I told you this. I know, I'm sorry, Do you have any idea what this looks like? His eyes scanned me like a TSA agent. Where's the scarf? My mouth opened. Closed. I gave it away, I said quietly. To who? Why? His voice cracked like a whip. There was a man on a bench. He was freezing. He hadn't eaten. My voice faltered. David stared at me like I had just lit a match in a gasoline factory. You were late because you gave away your lunch and a $700 scarf to a bum? My cheeks flushed with heat. He wasn't a bum. He was a person. He was hungry. David didn't respond. His silence was louder than shouting. And in that moment, something inside me snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. I had made a choice. Not the one David wanted. Not the one Arthur Sterling would expect, if he was the monster David made him out to be. But the one that mattered to me. The one my grandmother would have been proud of. I adjusted the hem of my dress, straightened my back, and looked him in the eye. If helping someone makes me a bad candidate for this family, then maybe I'm not the one who doesn't belong here. David's face went pale. But before he could answer, the giant oak doors behind him creaked open. A butler, thin as a shadow and dressed in black and white, appeared. Mr. Sterling will see you now, he announced. And just like that, the test, whatever it really was, had begun. The butler didn't wait for a response. He turned smoothly on his heel and walked back inside, the enormous carved oak doors yawning open behind him like the mouth of some great stone beast. I stood frozen at the foot of the steps, heart thudding against my ribs. David grabbed my hand again, his fingers cold and clammy. Just let me do the talking, he whispered urgently. Don't mention the scarf. Don't mention the bench. Don't mention your job. Just smile, nod, and say as little as possible. Please, Ava. Just be perfect. His words stung more than I expected. I wasn't his partner in this moment. I was an accessory, a liability he was trying to manage before the spotlight hit. Still, I nodded. Not for him, but because I wanted to know what kind of man could inspire such fear in his own son. The grand foyer swallowed us whole. Polished black and white marble tiles stretched out beneath our feet in an endless pattern. Oil paintings, portraits of solemn men and steely-eyed women, lined the walls like silent witnesses. A massive chandelier, all crystal daggers and ancient dust, hung above us like a frozen explosion. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and old money. Each of our footsteps echoed like a warning. The butler led us down a long, narrow hallway. The ceiling arched high above us, held aloft by carved columns and decorated with intricate plasterwork. Every few feet, there was a niche filled with antique sculptures or rare books behind glass. But it felt less like a home and more like a museum curated to intimidate. My heels clicked against the marble rhythmically, but David's were nearly silent. He walked beside me, stiff and jittery, his eyes darting to every passing detail like he was memorizing the battlefield. I couldn't help but notice that no one else was around. No kitchen staff. No other guests. Just us. Alone in this enormous, echoing house. When we finally stopped in front of a set of towering double doors made of dark wood, my breath caught. This, the butler intoned without emotion, is the main dining room. Mr. Sterling is expecting you. I felt a sudden rush of cold in my veins. David leaned in, still whispering instructions under his breath. Firm handshake. Make eye contact. Speak clearly. Whatever you do, don't. But I wasn't listening anymore. A sound filtered through the thick doors, a voice. Low. Raspy. Male. Familiar. Painfully familiar. No. My mind rebelled. That's impossible. The butler opened the doors. The dining room was vast, cathedral-like, with ceilings that soared and windows that stretched from floor to arch. At its center ran a single, gleaming mahogany table that looked like it could seat 30, but only one place was set. A single chair at the far end. And in that chair sat the man from the bench. Same face. Same wise, weary eyes. Same careful, deliberate movements. He lifted his hand to adjust the scarf I had wrapped around his shoulders not even an hour ago. My body went still. A bone-deep, full-stop stillness. It wasn't just similar. It was him. My feet stopped moving. My breath caught. Every thought I had, every rule I'd memorized, evaporated. David bumped into me from behind. "Ava," he whispered harshly. "What's wrong?" He followed my gaze down the table, and then he saw him. Arthur Sterling. The man who had vanished from the business world a decade ago. The man who now held David's future, and mine, in his hands. The blood drained from David's face so fast I thought he might faint. He stumbled backward a half-step and made a noise, half-gasp, half-choked disbelief. "Father," he stammered. What are you wearing? Are you okay?" Arthur didn't look at him. His eyes, those same clear, intelligent eyes, were locked on me. And then he smiled. A warm, knowing smile. "Welcome, Ava," he said. "Please, come in. Have a seat. I must apologize for my appearance earlier today." His voice was calm. Pleasant. The same as when he'd been sitting on that park bench. "I have a rather eccentric habit," he continued. "It tends to unsettle people." I couldn't move. My brain refused to reconcile the two images, the shivering man I'd offered my sandwich to, and the titan of industry seated before me like royalty. Behind me, David was still frozen, struggling to find words. "That man, that homeless man," he hissed under his breath, panic blooming across his face. "You were talking about him?" Arthur finally turned to his son. "David," he said, his voice now sharper. "You look surprised to see me." "You shouldn't be." His gaze flicked back to me, and softened. "You, on the other hand, surprised me quite a bit." He gestured to the chair to his right. "Please, Ava. Sit. There's much to discuss. About dinner. About the wedding. And perhaps, about the future of a company." I took a breath. Then another. The table stretched before me like a bridge I wasn't sure I was brave enough to cross. But I did. I walked slowly toward the seat of honor, every step an echo of the choice I'd made earlier, that being late was worth being human. I sat down beside the man I now realized saw me more clearly than the person I was supposed to marry. David, ghost pale, hovered behind me, uncertain. Arthur turned back to him briefly. "You may sit as well, David," he said. "Or you may go. The choice is yours." The weight of the moment pressed down like thunder. And all I could think was, this isn't the test David prepared me for. But maybe it's the one I was meant to take all along. The silverware gleamed in the candlelight. No one moved. Arthur Sterling leaned back in his chair as if he had all the time in the world. His voice, however, sliced through the tension like a blade. "I've had hundreds of people sit in this room," he began. "They all come dressed in their finest. Armed with prepared smiles and curated resumes. They say what they think I want to hear. They posture. They perform." He turned toward me again. "But not you, Ava." I felt David stiffen behind me, but I didn't look at him. My gaze stayed locked with Arthur's, because there was something in his eyes I wasn't expecting, warmth. Pride, even. "You failed my son's test," Arthur said. "But you passed mine. The only one that matters." My hands were folded neatly in my lap, but I could feel them trembling. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't expected to matter. Arthur gestured around the empty chairs. Dozens of men more powerful than David have sat here. Heirs to legacies, CEOs, polished socialites. But very few of them noticed anything beyond this table. None of them stopped to feed a man on a bench. David finally found his voice. You were pretending? You tricked us? Arthur raised an eyebrow. No, David. I observed. I watched. I've spent years watching, because money blinds people. Power hides character. But disguise, that reveals everything. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers. I didn't need to test Ava's pedigree, her education, or her clothes. I wanted to see what she'd do when there was no audience. When there was no benefit. And she did not disappoint. David's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Arthur continued. You see, my boy, the real currency in this world is not capital. It's character. He turned his gaze fully to his son now. The softness was gone. And you, who gave her a list of superficial rules, who begged her to hide who she was, revealed far more about yourself than you realize. Silence fell again, so complete I could hear the faint tick of the grandfather clock at the far end of the hall. Arthur reached up and gently removed the cashmere scarf from his shoulders. He held it between his fingers as though it were delicate silk, not expensive wool. This, he said quietly, is not just fabric. This was a choice. A sacrifice. A gesture of empathy in a world starving for it. He folded it neatly, then extended it toward me. It's yours. Thank you. It kept me warm in more ways than one. I reached out, accepting it with careful hands. The scarf was still faintly warm, like it had absorbed something more than just body heat. Your values, Arthur said, remind me of someone I once knew. Your mother, perhaps. Or your grandmother. Someone who taught you to see people, not just situations. That is rare. That is precious. Across the table, David slumped slightly in his chair, eyes fixed on the untouched silverware in front of him. Arthur glanced at him, almost absently. You always sought my approval, David. You thought if you played by the rules, said the right things, wore the right suits, you'd win. But you never asked what I was looking for. David finally spoke, his voice low and cracked. What were you looking for? Arthur didn't answer him immediately. Instead, he looked back at me. I was looking, he said slowly, for someone who would treat a stranger with dignity, even when they believed no one important was watching. Someone who understood that compassion is not weakness. That integrity is not negotiable. He let out a long breath, and for a moment, he looked tired. Not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. As if he'd spent years wading through pretense just to find one honest moment. And today, he said, more softly now, I found her. A small, grateful smile crept across my face. I hadn't come here seeking validation. But I felt like I had finally been seen. The butler returned then, as if on cue, and began serving the first course, a simple roasted beet salad with goat cheese and walnuts. But no one ate. Not yet. Arthur raised his glass of water, not wine, and looked at me. To kindness, he said. I lifted my glass. To truth. Across from me, David didn't move. The conversation that followed wasn't like any I'd imagined. Arthur didn't ask about my degrees or salary. He asked what book I was reading. I told him it was The Glass Castle. He asked me what I thought about inherited wealth, and I told him I was skeptical of any inheritance that didn't include empathy. He chuckled. He asked about my work, despite David's warnings, and listened intently as I described the after-school program I helped run, the community garden we were building in a low-income neighborhood, and the teenager I was mentoring who wanted to become a nurse like my mother. He nodded thoughtfully at each story, asking questions that were sharp, insightful, never performative. At some point between the main course and dessert, he said, I've built empires, Ava. But what you're building? That's something I could never buy. The words stunned me. And then he added, that's why I want you near. That's why I want you in this family. He didn't look at David when he said it. He didn't need to. When dinner ended, Arthur stood and walked with us to the front door. The night air had cooled, and the stars above the estate glittered like scattered diamonds. At the top step, he turned to David. You have a remarkable woman beside you, he said. Don't make the mistake of underestimating her again. Her values, her choices, they will carry this family farther than any business deal ever could. David didn't speak. Arthur looked at me one last time. You reminded me today of what I once believed in. I hope you never stop being exactly who you are. Then, in a softer tone, he added, and if anyone ever tries to change you again, send them my way. With that, he stepped back into the house and closed the door with a quiet finality. David and I walked to the car in silence. He unlocked it, got in, and sat motionless behind the wheel. I could see his reflection in the glass, his face drawn, pale, lost. As we pulled out of the long driveway, he whispered, I didn't know. I didn't see any of it. I didn't respond. Not yet. There would be time for that. The drive back to the city was quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet, where two people sit in peaceful understanding. It was the kind that sat between us like a wall, thick, heavy, and dense with unspoken things. David kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. His jaw was tight, like he was holding something back. I didn't push. The mansion, the chandelier, the scarf, Arthur's words, they were all still swirling in my head like a storm I hadn't quite stepped out of. It wasn't until we were back in our apartment, our small, lived-in space with uneven floors and the faint smell of lavender from last week's laundry, that he broke. David sat down on the edge of the couch, dropped his head into his hands, and began to cry. Real, unfiltered sobs. Not anger. Not frustration. Shame. I'm so sorry, he whispered. For everything. For making you feel like you had to be someone else. For treating you like a project. Like a resume I was editing. He looked up at me, eyes red and vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. My father has always been this looming figure in my life. I spent so long trying to please him that I forgot who I was. And worse, I tried to change you. Because I was afraid he wouldn't see you the way I saw you. I walked over and sat beside him. He didn't flinch when I took his hand. I didn't need him to see me, I said quietly. I just needed you to. He nodded, his throat tight. I do now. God, I do. That moment wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. And sometimes, real is enough. 3 months later, we got married. Not at a country club or in a ballroom, but in the sun-dappled backyard of my parents' home. The same backyard where I learned to ride a bike. Where my dad taught me how to plant tomatoes. Where my mom still hung wind chimes that jingled in the afternoon breeze. The ceremony was small, simple, and honest. No chandeliers. No silver cutlery. Just wildflowers in mason jars, handwritten vows, and people who loved us exactly as we were. Arthur Sterling was there. Not in a three-piece suit or behind a layer of intimidation, but in a tailored blazer, open collar, soft expression. And around his shoulders, draped like a quiet badge of honor, was my cashmere scarf. It was the only thing he wore that day that wasn't perfectly pressed or designer-made. And yet, it stood out the most. After the ceremony, he pulled me aside. You know, he said, there was a time when I thought building companies would make me proud. But sitting here today, watching you, this is what pride actually feels like. He handed me a folded note. I didn't read it until later, when we were alone in the soft light of the reception tent. Inside, in his tight, upright handwriting, it said, Real wealth isn't measured by the weight of your wallet. It's measured by the warmth you offer when no one is watching. You reminded me of that. Thank you. A.S. I often think back to that park bench. To the moment where I could have walked on. Where I nearly did. If I had, everything would have gone differently. I might have passed David's test, arrived on time, looked the part, played the role. But I would have failed myself. And that's the thing about character. It doesn't show up when you're being watched. It shows up when no one's looking, when the cameras are off, the rooms are empty, and you make a choice anyway. A sandwich. A scarf. A moment of kindness that could have been forgotten. Except it wasn't. It became the reason everything changed. Not because I gave to someone in need, but because I saw him as a person, not a prop, not a test, not a burden. Just a human. Arthur's methods were unconventional. But maybe, just maybe, the world needs more tests like his. The kind that remind us that integrity isn't outdated. That compassion isn't weakness. That true worth has nothing to do with fortune or bloodline, and everything to do with how you treat a stranger when no one important is watching. And that's a lesson I'll carry for the rest of my life. Sometimes, life presents us with choices that seem small on the surface, a sandwich, a scarf, a few minutes of our time. But it is in these seemingly insignificant moments that our deepest values are revealed. Ava didn't pass her test by being on time, dressing perfectly, or impressing a billionaire. She passed it by listening to her heart, by seeing humanity where others saw inconvenience, and by doing what was right even when no one important appeared to be watching. Through her quiet courage and unwavering kindness, Ava taught us that true strength lies in compassion. She chose to honor her conscience rather than a checklist. She remained loyal to her values, even when it meant risking everything she thought mattered. And in doing so, she exposed the hollowness of superficial judgments and reminded everyone, especially David and Arthur, what real integrity looks like. This story is not just about a surprise twist or a wealthy man's eccentric test. It's about the power of one moment, one act of empathy, to change the course of lives. It's about choosing truth over appearances and heart over status. In a world obsessed with perfection and perception, Ava's story is a call to return to what is real. It's a reminder that the worth of a person is not measured by what they wear, who they know, or what they own, but by how they treat someone who can do nothing for them in return. In the end, the quietest acts of courage often speak the loudest. And sometimes, the greatest test of character is the one you never knew you were taking.